Thanks so much. Well, welcome all. We're really excited that you're here, and we're really excited for Dr. Peirce. I want to know that Dr. Peirce and I have known each other for a little while, and so the intention here is to have a really casual conversation. Feel free to take yourself off mute, raise your hand, or ask questions throughout. We're going to carry the conversation, but we don't necessarily need to be the only ones talking. So feel free to kind of jump in as you see fit. If you are not familiar with Dr. Peirce, Dr. Peirce is a senior research associate at the Vera Institute of Justice. She leads lots of mixed methods research on ways to reduce criminalization and the use of jails, especially kind of at the local and county level. She's also a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. She completed her PhD in criminal justice at my alma mater, John Jay College, as well in 2021. Her dissertation analyzed incarcerated people's perceptions of prison reforms and conditions in the Dominican Republic. And previously, Dr. Peirce worked for over a decade in the international development space with NGOs in Central America, the Canadian Foreign Ministry, and the Inter-American Development Bank, and did mostly work on like human rights, crime, and violence issues in Latin America and the Caribbean. She's continued her work as a part-time consultant in the field and is now the co-founder of the American Prisons Research Network. So really excited to have Dr. Peirce here. With Dr. Peirce, we also have Christina Gutierrez with their really exciting, fun background. She's also from the Vera Institute of Human Resources. She's here to add some additional context about working at Vera, provide more general information about Vera, and answer any questions about applying to Vera. At one point in time, I used to be a lonely research assistant at Vera, so I know that this is probably right up everyone's alley, and excited to have Christina here to answer questions. If you're here, please feel free to chat with Christina throughout the conversation. She's here to answer any questions. So welcome, Christina. We're happy to have you.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Peirce, it's nice to see you. Mostly see you. I know that we have a little sun issue, but glad to see you and have you here.
Please call me Jen, Shannon.
I know, right? Well, I wanted to be professional, but here we are. As long as I've known you, you've always been doing corrections work and been doing corrections work all across the country, and corrections work significantly in Latin America and in the Caribbean. Can you kind of take us back a little bit and talk us about kind of like how your entree into these spaces and kind of your interest in doing this work more generally?
Yeah, sure. I have had a sort of meandering career path, so I didn't start out in academia or with the goal to ever go into academia. In my 20s, I lived for many years in Central America and worked with advocacy NGOs, and was focusing mostly on the effects of US foreign policy in terms of military policy and increasingly sort of post-Civil War implementation of peace accords, and then increasingly immigration, punitive immigration policies. And so through that work, this was in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, spent time in some of the prisons there, and realizing that focusing initially on people who were what we might call political prisoners, and then realized very quickly that the majority of people who are detained in prisons in that region are young men charged with being members of gangs, some of whom have pretty violent charges. And so it ended up shifting. And then simultaneously with that, this was in the 2000s when very hardline security policies started to proliferate. The US was funding like mega jails, hardline, so-called mano dura hardline policies. And so basically shifting away from the more formal post-war reconciliation of human rights issues into the human rights issues of people who were being incarcerated for what we might call regular crime, even though of course it's still political. So yeah, that was looking at both how national policies were affecting that, but also mainly how US and other international funding and kind of so-called development funding, as well as police and military funding was affecting that situation. So then I kind of realized that at a certain point I needed a master's degree to keep going in the NGO employment world. So I did an MA in international relations in Ottawa in Canada, and worked in the kind of on the Canadian side of things in the Canadian Foreign Ministry, doing basically donor program management and policy work on the same issues, still in the same region, as well as in South America. So that was kind of how and when I was back in Canada, I started volunteering in a couple prisons in Ottawa, and realized, of course, that all of these same issues are pretty prevalent in our countries as well.
Well, what's interesting, I think, about a lot of what you just explained really is that you've done a lot of on the ground work, and then really built, and what I'm hearing is kind of really built a long list of comparisons and research questions probably in your head, just being in so many different institutions and in so many different countries. Do you think that for folks that are looking to kind of move into industry spaces or move into spaces that are a little bit removed from traditional academia, that it requires having on the ground experience, or is that something you could collect along the way?
I think both are possible. I mean, I realize that I'm talking probably to an audience of people who are either in the midst of or completing graduate school, so this advice might be useless, but I do think that it's important to, in general, to kind of take some time and do other kinds of work before going back to grad school, especially something as intensive as a PhD program, just because it gives you that broader perspective. But of course, that can happen along the way. I think the biggest gap in doing applied research anywhere from what you learn in grad school is how to work with people in institutions that are messy and have different constraints, different political incentives, different ways of operating, and just basically how to deal with that. And then secondly, how to design research and work with data that are, again, constrained by the real world, instead of, like a laboratory data set that you can do a really clean analysis on. So you can, of course, get that along the way to an extent as a grad student, but I think that also just understanding kind of how the service provision aspect of it works is important, because, yeah, it just builds a degree of humility, I think.
I think this is really interesting. We'll spend a lot of time with this on with our rock stars in the future, Dr. Pitts from Urban, because he has a laundry list of critiques or thoughts about kind of working with practitioners and what that means for industry space. But I'm interested to hear from you to think about, this is something that is kind of popped up here and there in some of these conversations, is just this idea about understanding relationship building and understanding access and understanding how to negotiate these types of things. And I wonder, even if you're in a grad program, are there ways that you can still get those skills on traditional research projects that you have with faculty to be able to parlay that into industry spaces?
Yeah, I think you certainly can, if you are on a project that involves those kind of partnerships and you're working with a team that gives you the opportunity to be in some of those spaces and take on an active role as a grad student. And of course, that really depends on the project. I also think that you can do that, and I guess this is kind of one of my main messages, is that you can do that during school or after or before, while working in what we might call a regular job or a non-research job with those kinds of organizations on the side, and that is equally, if not more important, to kind of have just a different role in that organization and understand how things function from a non-research perspective, because that's often the gap that you're then trying to bridge as a researcher. So I think that either of those and the ability to connect them is certainly possible. I think one thing that we fall into in grad programs is just kind of like, any place that gives me access to data, I'm willing to work with. And so to be able to understand like why and how you're navigating that and for what ends you don't always have a lot of choices, but just kind of being deliberate about that is good. And sometimes it is more beneficial to work as a, I don't know, like a grants manager or a volunteer coordinator or something like that, just to get a flavor of how organizations work. It doesn't have, in my opinion, doesn't have to necessarily be a formal research position.
For sure.
I'm just going to take 1 second, turn on the light in my room. Hold on.
Yeah, no worries.
I will shamelessly highlight here as you talk about access to data. When I'm interviewing folks for research or data roles, I always like to ask the open question: if you could get your hands on any data set, no privacy laws or anything provided, what would it be and what would you use your analysis powers for? And I think that that's a really helpful way to think about the real world data that you're working with, or the clean data as a practitioner.
Christina, I think that's really, really interesting. And thanks so much for sharing that. I think it's helpful to kind of have a peek behind the curtain about kind of the questions that might come your way, for sure. And I think one of the things, I know this is kind of taking us off track a little bit on our question sheet, but one thing that I think is really important is just this idea of having worked through practitioner data, have what it means to hit blockades, what it means for somebody not want to share their data with you or not want to enter spaces, and then how you work through that. And one of the things that I think about that I was really fortunate in my experience was that I had faculty that let me really take the lead on doing those kind of negotiations. So when I parlayed that into an industry job, I could say I had years of experience negotiating access. I wonder, Jen, if you have thoughts about how students can advocate for themselves within their own programs with their faculty, and about, how do you talk to your faculty about saying, this is what I need to go over there and work over there? Do you have any recommendations of how students might be able to kind of get those skills with their own advisor and talk through that with them?
Yeah, I think there's probably more than two, but two categories that come to mind. Honestly, I think the best way is to do it through your own dissertation and to be ambitious and creative, because that's the opportunity where you have the most flexibility and the most autonomy and authority over things. And so finding a space where, yes, you have, of course, you need some kind of access, but also you have the opportunity to generate your own data, whether that's through qualitative work, through generating your own survey, through pulling together different sources. I think that the key, I think that sometimes the limitation in applied research that all of these organizations fall into is that we generate research questions and evaluation questions based on what's available, which is usually like a pretty narrow set of, whatever they enter into the database at X institution. And so if we actually want to know something, what kind of data would lead us there, and can you generate that? You may or may not be able to do that in your dissertation, but I think that's an important skill to develop, even if you're only partially successful in your thesis project. And then if you're working with faculty, which I don't have as much background on this, so I won't speak to it as much, but I've done it in other jobs. On a bigger grant where there's kind of like bigger stakes and the organizations or some entity has put a bunch of money into this, it's about like figuring out how you can get more out of what's available or connect the data. So rather than just taking what they give you and running the analysis that they expect and saying, yes, you got outcome A, B, and C, like trying to get some other angle on it so that you're really led by the questions that matter. And that usually requires, maybe, for example, I've had to go and sit with, the intake officer at a prison and say, like, show me an example. It doesn't have to be a real person, but show me an example of your intake form. What are the questions that you ask that go into this field? What are the questions that you ask that go into this field? What do you do if they don't know? How do you use the notes section? And then you realize that, like, oh, there's this other thing that they're tracking, but it's not documented, or this doesn't mean what we think it does. And so kind of like doing the applied work that goes behind admin data can be really important. And that's sometimes where you figure out like why it's not making sense or why something's missing, or how you can say, well, if you guys going forward start documenting this, then we could essentially generate a new variable out of this. And we don't always have time to do that, but I think if you do, that's really helpful.
I think, one of the things that you bring up that certainly speaks to my qualitative heart is this idea that even watching small processes really just gives you a grander idea of how to look at administrative data of any data set, right? Because you have a more critical eye of the data to be able to say, this doesn't look right, or that's probably not right, or a critical eye to understand that administrative data, while certainly objective and systematically robust, is still people entering data. And that discrepancy of people entering data might mean something for us. And how do we then take people entering data into an account when we're doing this? And I think I often struggle myself sometimes when I listen to presentations about research that portion there of like people not understanding, the nuances of data sets really comes from not understanding how the data is actually entered by the organization. And I think that, what you're describing is really just like get access to doing like site visits to observe, or get access to just shadow people to understand the process. And I think that all of those things can happen outside of grants. They can happen outside of traditional working spaces. They can happen by taking on your own initiative and knocking on the door and saying, hey, I'd like to learn more about this. And I know lots of organizations that certainly would say like, come on in and, we use your set of hands or something else while you're here, kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now I know you're at Vera now, and I want to spend some time with folks, especially while we have Christina here, to kind of diving into your work at Vera. And so you come to Vera with lots of experience in consulting and lots of experience in applied spaces, international spaces. And so before we kind of dive into kind of the meat and potatoes of what you do at Vera, can you kind of situate Vera in kind of the larger AltAc industry space? So what would you call Vera? Would you call it kind of a think tank, a research center, a consulting center? Like, how would you situate it with other things that are out in the market?
Yeah, probably different people would have different answers. So Christina, please chime in. First, it's a nonprofit organization, which is different than a lot of the for-profit firms. And I think it probably would still be classified as a think tank, but I think that increasingly it's, research plus advocacy work and a lot of hands-on kind of technical assistance and policy work. And so Vera's internal structure has integrated the research functions more closely with those other functions, but is still regarded as a research nonprofit think tank for that component of the work, and works nationally. So a lot of organizations have a more regional focus. And then also Vera has an exclusive geographical focus on the United States. And so in the past has done some international work, but currently, and I think for the foreseeable future, is focusing on the US, where there's certainly plenty to do. Christina, do you want to add to that?
I think you hit everything on the head. I will just enforce the yes to the nonprofit and yes to the think tank, and just really the developments of programs that come onto our pipeline and are worked through that think tank are all advised by the research that's being done. So if we can't show the research, if we can't show the information that we're living to our theory of change of what we're saying we want to make an impact in, that's when our strategy has to pivot and change. So it's really dependent on the research. So they're one in the same, but really it's relied on the research that's being done to be able to spit something out the other side.
Awesome. Thanks, Christina.
I would just add to that Vera isn't a sort of traditional evaluation firm, and there are those out there. So we do policy evaluation work integrated within broader projects, but I think used to do more of this, and now more rarely will do a one-off program evaluation where you're just evaluating the program with no other role in that program.
Well, and given that, that there's such an integration between policy, between research, and then some technical assistance, can you give us kind of, before we dive in even further, can you kind of give us a high level when you say Vera does policy work or Vera does technical assistance work, particularly for folks who are unfamiliar with either policy work or technical assistance work? Can you kind of give us a high level of what that means to Vera?
Yeah, I can give a few examples from the sector that I work in, and we work in several different topics across the criminal legal system as well as the immigration system in the US. Working in the kind of pretrial county jail, like basically our team's broad goal is to reduce or eliminate the use of local county jails for detention. And so policy-wise, there are state level policies and local policies that influence the flow of people in and out of jails. And so that includes obviously things like the criminal code and et cetera, but it's largely about how bail policy, which has state level legislation in many places, and also local county policies, as well as agency policies, and then discretion from different actors. So there are, categories of charges for which certain things apply, and then prosecutors have discretion over certain choices, judges have discretion, and so kind of mapping all of that out and who does what is, and then influencing changes in those policies. So for example, if a district attorney wants to adopt a policy just for their office that they will not be requesting money bail for a series of charge types or based on other kinds of criteria, or that they would have to meet additional proactive criteria for doing that. There are examples of those policies, of the results of those. There's a lot of media pushback that is completely inaccurate that people get confused about. So kind of walking through what are the policies, what's statutory, what's discretionary, what's about decisions like, for example, temporarily in COVID, lots of things had emergency measures. Some of those are now being codified into more permanent policies. So that's kind of a mix of the legal and the operational. And then a lot of it is really looking at and the researchers do a lot of work on translating the available literature from other places to people in organizations that are trying to do it in their space. So let's take state X with county Y. They want to know, like, what happened in New Jersey? How did that work at the state level? What happened at the courts? What did the judges do? Oh, our stuff is different here. So we have to work through these different factors, these different political resistances. We don't have, a publicly funded public defender's office here. We have this instead. So kind of a lot of that is technical assistance. And then on the research, and so developing what are the statutory, policy, operational, and internal cultural practices that will, as a package, make this piece of the system work in a different way. And then from the research side, it's about looking at, like, what are the things that you actually want to change in terms of outcomes, what are the metrics, but also just kind of breaking down stuff that I think most people throw around but don't always understand, like, why should we not, what are the limitations of using FBI crime data as a proxy for the well-being of your community? That's a big one. Or more narrowly, like, how are we tracking, police cite and release? Like, how are they supposed to document a case where they decide not to charge someone? So the counterfactual, like, how are everything that doesn't end up in formal administrative data, how are we tracking that? And are there unintended consequences to documenting that by a cop versus by someone else, and kind of feeding that through? Plus, of course, all the other more positive metrics that we want to be tracking about whether people, feel like their community is doing better, feel like they were treated with more respect and transparency by the authorities, et cetera. But I find that a lot of it is really explaining existing research to institutions and community groups. So like, this place implemented text message reminders for court dates. This is what happened there. This is how you could do this here. This is what you should track, like something very concrete. And then something much more broader, like, how does a judge assess dangerousness? That's like a whole different thing. But so yeah, that's what I mean why it's very integrated across.
Well, and given that then and maybe this is both a Christina and Jen question, is given that then if I came to Vera and I only had a research experience, where I only had policy experience, where I maybe only did technical assistance, could I still thrive there? Or do I have to have all three to be able to kind of really be successful on these projects that are it sounds like everything is so integrated. So do you have to have all three experiences to thrive there and to be integrated on these projects?
You don't have to have all of them, and it really depends on I think people are more versatile than we like to think, and we kind of tend to box ourselves. There are people with PhDs working in legislative advocacy. There are people with legal training working in research, et cetera. There are people who have zero formal education in all of the above, but who have worked in the sector for a long time and are extremely skilled and knowledgeable. And so of course, it depends on the job. So some of the research jobs are, you need to be able to do quantitative analysis of this kind of data, and you need to be able to do it in R, and you need to be able to talk about this and unpack a regression for a group of local officials, but others are a bit more broad. So I would say the research positions tend to be a little more strictly defined, and the program positions are a little more open-ended, but it really kind of depends on the project. And I think that it is worth applying broadly and talking about how your experience would apply to what that position needs, rather than saying, I can only be this one thing. Christina probably has more thoughts on that.
Yeah, again, I'll echo all of that, and just sort of more generally for roles at Vera, you can be a subject matter expert in one thing, but you can also have a really strong passion and drive for the other. And that really speaks leaps and bounds above, here's my list of all the things that I've done and can do. It's actually about, and like you said, Shannon, the peek behind the curtain. What I'm looking for is your narrative. I'm looking for why you want to take your experience and your skills and apply it to a role at Vera. One of the things that I will highlight as well is that we hire previously incarcerated individuals, people who have returned home, and they are subject matter experts, literally, in these systems that we're trying to fix and trying to make better. So there's a great mixture of it. No hiring cycle is the same ever, because what the team looks like when we're hiring person one and what the team looks like when we're hiring person two, there's different windows, if I can use that, to fill in each time. It's not looking to bring in the same, it's looking to bring in folks who have experience and knowledge and a passion to uplift and continue contributing to the existing team.
We were talking to another rock star a couple of weeks ago, and we had this running joke that I heard somebody told me, and then I repeated it, and I think maybe it works here too, is that, we're all just really looking to work next to people who are also medium curious, and that we're all really interested in we're all medium curious about everything. And so we all might have a skill set, a methodology skill set. And in these spaces, you might come in, at one point in time, I would call myself a correction scholar, but I'm sitting in a courtroom because now I almost exclusively do court related work, right? And it's this idea that I have a methodology background that allows me to apply that methodology background in multiple spaces, ask multiple types of questions. And because I'm medium curious, I'm going to be really interested in all of these spaces. And I wonder, Christina, if that's also to some extent kind of what you're getting at, is that you have the ability to maybe sell yourself a little bit more, brand yourself a little bit more as a generalist who might have an expertise in a couple things, but is really excited to do anything that's really centered in making the system more effective, fair, and humane.
100%, and particularly around an organization like Vera, where our mission is so important. You can't wake up in the morning and be like, I only medium care about changing the world and the space that we live in. You have to have that with your whole heart and saying, this is my background. transferable skills will take you everywhere. And a lot of how we focus on, when I do trainings on your resume or your LinkedIn profile and what I want to see, I want to be able to understand your narrative before you give it to me. I need to understand who the person behind the work is, because then I can see the potential of where you could fit in. And I'm a huge champion for the underdog when it comes to that. Like you want to be a researcher, or you want to be a, an operations manager? Okay, sell it to me. I can see that. Let's talk more.
Totally. I think that makes a lot of sense. So now, I mean, Jen, you've kind of explained a lot of kind of what the projects look like at Vera that are really integrated projects, knowing that you're kind of moving to that model. Is there any one project that you specifically have worked on that you feel really passionate about or really proud of, or that really just jazzed you, or was, I don't know, it just brought out some kind of emotive side in you? Is there anything at Vera in particular?
Yeah, a couple different ones I can mention. The project that I actually started at Vera as a part-time doctoral fellow, and then I applied and was hired on a project as a full-time researcher, and that was called the Rural Jails Research and Policy Network. And so we worked in 2 states with university partners, actually, but we basically worked to get, this is the publication in the chat, we worked with sheriff's offices in rural counties in Washington and Georgia to basically just do a basic analysis of their jail population trends, the reasons people were entering charge-wise, the pathways by which they were released. And so that was really challenging because of the, we worked with a local partner because these places were pretty skeptical of a big liberal NGO from New York just parachuting in. So we kind of worked through, we were very backstage in that, but that worked pretty well. And then just we got data in all forms, from like pretty clean databases to horrible PDFs to boxes of paper. And so figuring out how to actually, but this was talking with them and figuring out what we could do with what was available, what could be filled in. And they're so short staffed. And then thinking about what we could meaningfully say about their reasons. And of course, every county thinks that they're super unique, but a lot of trends were common to the whole country. A lot of these are small places saying that their jails are overflowing and totally crowded with extremely dangerous people charged with serious violent felonies. And in fact, the majority of people are charged with suspended driver's licenses, failures to appear in court, et cetera. And so just actually laying that out, but working in partnership, I think some people sincerely didn't actually realize that that was the case because of just the day-to-day churn. And so that was pretty interesting and just gave me a perspective on it reminded me more of working in Latin America, where, you only have a limited amount of data, and a lot of it is just kind of like working with partners to explain what is and isn't possible, rather than like if you're working with New York DOC, you don't need to have that conversation. They have other problems. So anyway, that was interesting, and I think we were able to generate something out of it. We do have another qualitative report that's going to be coming out in the next couple of months from that. And then another project I worked on was with a county in North Carolina called Buncombe County, and we did a project funded by the MacArthur Foundation that was basically interviewing the women in the jail there, but we did this during COVID. So we had to do many iterations of the research design because it was first going to be in person, and we ended up doing it on Zoom. And so figuring out the qualitative design for remote work with detained women, and kind of also how to pull out the themes that were applicable to the jail as a whole versus the themes that were really specific to women's experiences, and doing so in a way that kept the partners engaged and able to see that some of the suggested changes were manageable, because I think like the degree of negative experiences that comes through when you do, like we interviewed almost every single woman who was detained there during a given month, and the amount, which was about 50 people, and the amount of bad experiences was like quite overwhelming, and I think they didn't expect that. And so to try to break that down in a series of meetings to say like, yeah, some of this stuff is structural, some of it is difficult to reach, but some of it actually you could, you know, change how you distribute hygiene supplies. You could change how you organize the schedule for phone access. You can also, you know, talk to these outside actors about different services. This might still be possible despite COVID protocols, et cetera. So kind of still being honest and authentic to the data, but working with institutions in such a way that they don't just say like, this is too much, we can't do it, and sort of drop the partnership. I think that was a big part of the challenge, to have continue and persist in those conversations. And they were very, I give them a lot of credit for also persisting.
That's awesome. Those sound really interesting. One thing that comes up for me as you were talking is, in both cases, although differently, as you know, as the researcher there, you're having to remain nimble, right? So like the first one of, you know, you're getting boxes of data or PDF files or hand files, right? And how often that actually really does happen when you're doing large scale research. And then in the second, you know, you have COVID protocols or working through it, you know, being nimble about what the data collection looks like rather than what the data itself looks like. And I wonder, you know, is kind of being nimble, being flexible, being the ability to like kind of go with the flow a little bit, is that a skill set that do you think is kind of required or heightened in a space like Vera, or just like it so happens to be that on those projects it required you to be nimble?
I think it's required like across that kind of experience. I think is pretty common across all projects, but I also think it's common in academic projects where you're working with, you know, real world people and organizations. So I don't think it's unique to the think tank world in that sense. So as long, you know, anytime that you're managing an outside partnership or data that comes from what people have generated in imperfect processes, I think that that's required. The difference in a place like Vera, I think, compared to regular or typical academic research projects, even the ones that are grant funded, is just like the timeline is a lot quicker. And so there isn't, you don't have 3 to 4 years to kind of set up the whole thing and get through it. And there are political events or other events that kind of drop in. Sometimes they're predictable, sometimes they're not. Like, for example, the sheriff or the DA loses the election and you no longer have a friendly partner, or you suddenly have a friendly partner, or you know, some incident happened locally that completely changes the conversation and now it needs to focus on X. So that I think it's impossible to be as thorough and as sophisticated in the methodology, because people want, and you have to sort of share pieces of the research as you go rather than wait for the final product. So you're like, this is where our sampling strategy is at now, and this is where it might or might not go. And then at the end, you have to say like, this is what we said 6 months ago. This is what we ended up with. This is why it's still valid. And this is what you can do with it.
One thing that I was also hearing, you know, as you were talking, particularly thinking about the jail report, is really thinking about that the audience for what you're producing is characteristically different, right? In this case, your audience was the jail, and really thinking about how do we take what we've learned to even move the needle even ever so slightly, right? Like we're just changing like how you distribute, you know, hygiene products. We're just changing ever so slightly the scheduling for phone calls, right? These things that are really low, perhaps low hanging fruit at a practical level, but it's less about how do we take these findings and how does it apply to theoretical frameworks? And it's how do we take these findings and even move this facility or move this organization even slightly closer to their goal line, even if it's an inch. And I wonder, was there a transition period for you to have to think about how you write to that kind of audience and how you write to that kind of deliverable rather than thinking about it more theoretically?
Yeah, to an extent, and but I had also done that in my previous work before university. So honestly, it was more of a transition, or before my PhD. So it was more of a transition to have to write an extensive theoretical section in my academic work than the reverse. But I will say that I think in the applied space, one of the challenges that we all face, and this should also apply to academic work, and it really depends on who's leading it, is that there's a temptation, I think, to just be incremental. And like, yes, we have to help them get to these places of this agency can move this, or look for the low-hanging fruit or the quick win. But I think one of the reasons that the corrections reform field has completely failed, frankly, over the last 30 years is that everyone really celebrates that as like, okay, mission accomplished. And we implemented this risk assessment. Now everything will be fine. Or we changed, now solitary confinement doesn't exist here because we let people out of their cell for 4 hours a day or whatever. And that's somehow a success. And so, yes, let's validate that that's important and difficult to accomplish and makes a real difference in the immediate lives of people. But that's why we try to put a bigger frame to say, yes, you can change your charging policy around low-level charges or unpaid fines and fees or FTAs, but what's actually happening here is that your entire approach to how you think about problematic behavior in your community is that you're criminalizing this entire sector of behaviors that are stemming from economic precarity or from substance use. And just like to constantly bring people back to that and say, if you actually want things to change, you have to look at this bigger category, because it's, especially if you're working in government, and I've done it too, of course you want to be able to say we accomplished X, Y, and Z, and yes, let's say that, but we don't actually make big change until we force that bigger conversation of, in fact, this entire set of behaviors should be off the books entirely. And sometimes municipal ordinances have, that can be done through local government. Sometimes it has to be done at the state level. So kind of bringing that back, or saying, no, it's actually not about your staff shortage or your budgetary, it's about these choices about how you're thinking about what's worth it or what's not in terms of how you're deploying your existing resources. So I find that to be both the most difficult, but the most important conversation, because I think incrementalism is both necessary and very dangerous if we're just satisfied with that.
I hear you. I mean, I think you're speaking to my heart. I feel like, my colleagues and I have this debate all the time where, we have the 3 sections that you write, like the things you could do now, the things we really want you to do in the next year, and the things that are really going to change the system,
right.
Big ticket items. And
they're like,
you're like, no, I always like writing the big ticket items, right? That's the time to just like pound the keyboard and like, you should do this, right? Mm-hmm. And so I really appreciate that. But what I appreciate about it is that it requires, though, a different kind of level of thinking, because you're still asking practitioners to change the way they're thinking rather than thinking about developing knowledge just for kind of knowledge sake. And so I wonder, kind of to take a step back then, we've kind of talked about being nimble. We've talked about that the deliverables are a little different and they might have to sound differently, that the audience is different, right? And I wonder, with a step back, are there a set of skills that you can come in with, and besides being medium curious, Christina, are there a set of skills that you can come in with that will absolutely set you up for success at a place like Vera?
Yeah, I mean, one thing which I think is something that you do learn in a doctoral program and is really worth uplifting is the ability to digest and be familiar with a wide body of research and kind of like distill it into the key points that a lay audience should take away. So not yes, you should be able to write a huge lit review for an academic article or for your thesis, but to be able to say, look, the entire field of research on this topic for the past 20 years has really like not just saying I have these 27 citations, but to be able to say in normal person speak that, the key takeaways from this are that we know without really any doubt that longer, more punitive sentences have no effect on deterrence of future recidivism, or like things that are kind of standard in crim that still need to be reiterated to practitioners, and then say what that means is that, or like more intensive probation conditions and more frequent enforcement by probation officers doesn't actually lead to better compliance, even if you're measuring it by traditional metrics like recidivism. So to be able to say that, have a couple studies to cite, but to be able to just talk practicalities, but to be able to have the backing to just push back on some of the false assumptions that continue to persist. And then to like say, if you really want to see how this plays out in your locality, this is what we could do. Because also, you know, national findings can feel pretty abstract, or, you know, what happened in California isn't going to resonate with a county in Georgia. So yeah. I think that those skills are important out of grad school. And then the other one is, like I was saying before, just the ability to kind of work with real world data, real world people, and write kind of shorter, more accessible pieces that still have the methodological rigor behind them, but you keep that in an appendix and, you know.
I know, I appreciate all of the grants that are like, you could write in a technical appendix if you want to, but you don't have to. Great. I will not be doing that. I mean, I think you're right. I think that the ability to take what was a sophisticated analysis and put it together in a paragraph and a half that, you know, I could send to my neighbor and say, hey, read this. This is really exciting work that's happening in our community, I think is ultimately the bottom line, because I would imagine in a place like Vera that's so mission driven, it's important that the community itself also understands the research that's happening about the community itself.
Yeah, totally. And I'll just put one more link in the chat on a more technical level. Like, this is more for data people, but we wrote this. This is kind of a guide to try to help people who are more data inclined, whether researchers or otherwise, in communities to, and it's just a kind of nuts and bolts on how to work with jail data, including like if you have coding abilities and can do scraping, but also like what are the questions and the framing. And I think that that kind of thing is important, because the research design skills and the ability to define the right question, it can be easy to skip right into, you know, let me look at your Excel sheet. But so this is something that I don't think the majority of our audience would want to read, but there's a subset who really appreciated this. And we've done some workshops to kind of help people build their skills on that front.
I would also like to add, I think it's really important that you highlight the being able to take a full report, truncate it, and deliver it to your neighbor. That is such a necessary element when you're in sort of the academic space. You speak the same language. That's also happens in the professional space. We speak jargon and we have to catch ourselves when we're doing that. So you have to be able to translate what you translated. You did all this work and you're like, done. Nope, absolutely not, because you have to be able to come over to me. I speak people. I don't speak data, but I rely on the data to inform my decisions, and everything that we're doing within the institute, again, is rooted in data based on this research. But we have to know then what our next steps are and why. The other piece that I would add, as far as what you need to come into any of these positions with, there's a lot of experience that you get when you're in a position and you're really, your neck is on the line, you know, there's something at stake. There are people who are depending on the work that you're producing, again, to inform those decisions. I've spent all of this time studying. That's amazing. Where have you had the opportunity to potentially send something in the wrong direction? And that's how you can talk about, yeah, that's how I've done this here. This is how I can advocate for myself. Or this is also how I can understand the leveling that I may come in without having any of that outside of the academic space experience.
Christina, I think you raised this really good point that in these spaces, and I think Jen said this earlier too, these spaces move very fast and they're very hungry for knowledge and very hungry for your findings. In fact, I gave a presentation sometime in January and I said, here's a document, it's a draft. And by the end of the meeting, somebody had already mailed it off to someone else. And I had to, say, no, we have to recall it, right? It's a draft. And it's because they're so thirsty to move and to move quickly, and to do something with this information. And I think you're right, Christina, this idea that these spaces, you can have a really great impact, but with that also comes a great responsibility in which you might actually send a jurisdiction in the wrong direction, or it might not be fleshed out enough for them to use it. And you have to really do some more workshopping with them to be able to hold on to it and to be able to kind of move it into a real change management, right? And I think, I don't know that I've ever thought about it that way before, but I think you're right. I think that feels like, it feels like a really important contribution to your resume if you have the ability to speak to that and speak to how how sites are thinking about your work and how important it is, and how you may have also potentially led them astray, the responsibility you had to kind of shepherd them through a change.
Certainly. And I will also add, obviously none of this work is done by any one team alone, but it's also important to understand the nuances of where you're working. Vera is a 501c3, and we also have a 501c4. Those two branches can speak very different languages based on the same data. We can say things in the C4 arm that we cannot even think about uttering on the C3, even though we're reading the same data. What are we highlighting has to be super specific.
Kristen, I think that's a really important characterization. And that's in part why, I certainly asked Jen to kind of situate us in the very beginning, because I think it certainly matters if you work for a for-profit or not-for-profit organization. It matters then who the deliverables are, who your audience is, what you can say, how much freedom in that thought you have, right? And I think all of those things may or may not matter to you as a employee of those spaces, but it's worth asking those questions of the organization so you know kind of the restrictions that you're walking into, even in the application process. I think while we have Christina here, as I know that Jen, you talked a little bit about, you started as a postdoc fellow, and then you transitioned to a full-time space. What otherwise, maybe this is more for Christina, what does the typical hiring process at Vera maybe look like then? And kind of from start to finish, I send my application to, I got hired, how long can folks expect that process to look like?
Yep, that's my wheelhouse. So I may or may not have said it, but I'm the Associate Director of Talent Acquisition and Onboarding at Vera. And I think that wherever your seat is in the house, you need to think that you have the best seat. And that's certainly how I feel. I get to situate myself between candidate and colleague. So you're the first, person that's applying for this role. What does that look like? Your resume comes in. It is reviewed by myself or my team of talent acquisition associates. We're looking at your information. I will share a fun data point that I didn't even realize was real until a couple of years ago, because I used to say your resume has 6 seconds to tell me I want to know more, or it's not a fit. The data that came out in, I think, 2014, it's updated at 6.7 seconds. So you got a little bit more time of the person reviewing your information. So Jen and I were chatting about this, the way that a resume looks like when you're submitting your experience for a role at Vera versus a role maybe in the academic space. I'm looking for E and F patterned resumes, so I am naturally reading and seeing the things that stick out. Even before I read your resume, I have met with the person who's going to be overseeing this and understanding what is it that you're looking for with this hire, for this position. Again, we can all think, I have all of the skills. It all meets the same, what you're looking for. This hire is different. The job description may be the same. We're looking for the same qualifications, but we know what you're going to be doing once you get into the position. So usually it starts off with a screening conversation with, again, myself or a member of the team. And then we design the process to be as best as it can be for the candidate experience and also for the hiring manager to make a really concerted decision based on who's going to be coming in. So that's usually going to consist of a one-on-one conversation with the hiring manager, some sort of written assessment or exercise, an analysis, potentially presenting that depending on the level that you're coming in at, meeting with a panel, people who would be crossing paths with your work, potentially at a more managerial level or peer. And then we like to have sort of a formal, I'm sorry, not a formal, an informal conversation touch point at the end, again, saying, what do you think about all of this now that you've gotten to understand and gotten in the weeds? Is this role still what you thought it was? Because we think that you're awesome. Let's chat. And that's a really fun part because we've gotten to know so much about you as a candidate. So from application to hire, I just pulled the data for our president and director. The last roles that we extended offers for, it was 13 weeks time to hire. 12 to 16 weeks is the average of what you can expect, because scheduling and all of those things that go into it, we're still also doing all the work to push the mission forward.
Absolutely. And with that, then, is there any flexibility in perhaps start date or, because it's a two-part question, flexibility in start date as you're kind of hiring on? And then does Vera kind of follow these kind of like academic cycles per se of hiring, or is really hiring happening at any time?
So I'll answer the last one and then go to the first one. We are hiring at all times. All cylinders are going. Our structure has changed a little bit, and without going too much into the weeds, we have what's called the impact pipeline. And people who are employed at Vera can say, hey, I think there's a case for this type of work to be done. That's really where that think tank is really beginning and stirring and happening. And as that process goes through different stages, that person is now leading that, and therefore the role that they sat in before, maybe they're going to be vacating it because they're now leading a different part of the work. So it's always happening. Our internships, those do follow an academic calendar. So we have internships year round, spring, fall are shorter, more part-time, with the summer internships really having a greater opportunity for full-time employment. And then as far as start date, again, I speak people. From the beginning of our conversation, one of the logistics questions I ask, I say, you know, in the near future, do you have any African safaris or siestas in Spain that you have planned that we should know about because you're living your life and things don't revolve around us? Let's talk about that and see what that looks like. We also understand that people are likely in another role, and if we're going to say drop it like it's hot, get out of there and come join us, what are they going to do when it's their time to leave us? They're going to drop us that way. So we really want it to be the timing to depend on the candidate and also what works best for the team. It has to be, don't go work in places where they are strict and hard and cold for no reason. We are human beings. We are dynamic. We have dynamic needs. So never be afraid to advocate for yourself, and also to offboard where you're leaving from. Particularly in our space, it is this big and paths will cross again. So don't be that person. We have a no, insert the bad word policy there, and in how we approach things.
I appreciate that, Christina. I appreciate the people speak, because I had a Moroccan safari planned when I
Look at
started my
you.
job. And so I was, I started early, but I said to my boss, like, I'm going to Morocco and I'm going on a safari, and we worked it out. But I think you're right. I think that's something that's often not described, is that like you can live your life, and then the place that hires you, if they really want you, and honestly, if you would want to be in a place that's going to work with you anyway and understands that you live a life outside of that workplace. I think people forget that you can kind of plan around that, right? You can say like, hey, that's already on the books, we can move through that. We can negotiate through kind of a benefits package, or even considering that already off the jump. And I don't know that people really quite understand that. So I appreciate, Christina, you letting us know that we can take our Spanish siestas and our fiestas at the same time, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if I can advocate for anyone, it's that you advocate for yourself. You have that opportunity, and you're right, Shannon, if the organization, if the company wants you, they're going to, be open. You need to be open as well and say, hey, this is what I have going on for me.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to add a plug. I know we have other topics to cover too, but on the internships, I know that some of them can look a little kind of general, or you might think that if you're a doctoral student or already finished, that internships aren't for you. So I would just say, look at them carefully and don't hesitate to contact like team leads or senior researchers on teams that fit with your work and experience and ask about internships, because some of them are appropriate for the doctoral level. The pay scale is higher if you have doctoral training than if you are in undergrad. We hire both. And so that's really worth considering. And it's a good entry point, a good way to get your name known in the organization. It's also fine to just I think contact people at Vera who are doing work that's relevant to your background or your interests, and say even if there isn't a position, to say, here's my CV, this is what I'm interested in. I'm available for, short-term or part-time research assistantships, which may or may not happen, or keep me posted on jobs, or just doing that direct outreach is important. And it's sometimes hard to tell from a job posting what the specifics are. So sometimes you just need to have that conversation directly, knowing that you may or may not get a response. It may or may not be a fit, but it's worth a try.
Jen, I think you bring up something that I think you and I have separately had conversations about extensively, is this idea that the only appropriate work in grad school is work that happens at a university in a traditional GRA position with a traditional faculty member, and how much is lost by that thinking, both in terms of experience and then also in terms of money, to be quite honest with you. And so, for students who you've now just kind of blown their mind that maybe they could actually go get a job outside of their university and get all the same experiences and get paid more. How other than contacting people or looking at or throwing out CVs or saying, hey, I'm open even for part-time work, are there other spaces or other things that folks can be doing? And how do you even as a student have that conversation even with your department, hey, I'm going to potentially go leave and do this? And is it worth even having that conversation? I mean, clearly,
okay, there's a few questions in there. I will unpack a few. First of all, I think, everyone's situation is different. People have different limitations in terms of the rules of your program or your funding or your work visa. So, keeping all of that in mind, in my opinion, as long as you're on side with all of those applicable rules, my view is that you don't have to explain or get permission for your choices during your doctoral program, and you can choose to do whatever kind of work you want, even if a professor tells you that you'll never get a job in academia if you don't serve as an RA on this or that thing. And sometimes you just have to develop a bit of a thick skin for that kind of commentary and say, thanks for your opinion, and leave it at that. And I do think there are a lot of faculty members who are doing more applied work and just figuring out who has grants with outside organizations, working with them. Those kind of connections open up future consulting work, and inside or outside, and just knowing how to work in an externally grant funded practical project is useful. So I think that you also don't have to decide now whether or not you're going on the academic track or not. And it's possible to kind of keep that open or apply on different things, go back and forth, et cetera. So I think also we have this, like, you have to be in box A or box B. So you don't, and you also don't have to share all of your thinking and your doubts and your meandering considerations about life choices with your advisor, even if you're very close to them and they happen to be supportive. There are other people out there who can give you other perspectives. So I think just seek a lot of perspectives and have conversations with outside groups. And one of the resources I posted here, Beyond Prof, like there are places that you can actually pay professionals who know this world to talk about these options. In terms of working during the degree program, I think that honestly, the best way to get those opportunities is through people you've already worked with. So again, if you're working with an organization in a different role, then they might consider you to do like a, I don't know, some type of short report or an evaluation work. If you're working with a professor who has a partnership through an externally grant funded thing, then you can, introduce yourself to that organization and say, I'm available for future work. And that's how I did it through my previous work at the Inter-American Development Bank. I had some of those connections with that organization itself, as well as with people I had met in the course of that work. So I basically developed a short professional CV and tailored it for the type of work that I was pitching for, which is different than Vera. So this is, actual evaluation work, also writing kind of background lit review, but for a operational audience kind of reports. I contributed background material to, contacting some of these big organizations that put out big annual reports, like the one that puts out the global prison trends, the annual report on armed violence, like some of these big national reports. They'll have sectors where they need someone to write up like how this works in this country, or pull all the data available, the annual homicide report from the UNODC, that type of thing. So again, you can put out a lot of cold calls and 95% of them will get no response, but you never know. And then through connections and referrals, you will find a few things. And once you have a couple writing samples, like I wrote this for this group, I wrote that for that group, that helps to generate more. So that's kind of my take on doing that during the course of your grad career. The other way to do that is through your dissertation work. Of course, if you're doing work with outside groups in partnership for your own project, you can apply for grants, but also the groups you meet along the way, as long as it doesn't conflict with the parameters of your dissertation project, you can, I did work, for example, developing, kind of helping people develop evaluation metrics for a particular corrections policy, even though it was also in the field that I was studying, it wasn't directly with the same organization. So I think that that's important. I'll put a couple websites in the chat, but there's also websites where for-profit consulting groups in the international sphere are always looking for subject matter experts and evaluation experts. And again, this is a bit of you send your CV into the black hole and you may or may not get a call, but putting your name on these rosters, you will eventually get some inquiries and they may or may not fit. So just kind of slowly building that is my advice on that front. Yeah.
Well, I super appreciate that. I mean, I think, one thing that I love, and, I wish maybe we can find a way to just make a clip of it so we can just hit replay every once in a while, right? Is this idea that like, you don't actually need permission from your university to make decisions about your life. And I think that feels so odd because we live in an academic permission structure that we like forget that we live in sometimes, and I think that just remembering that, right? I separately, I had a conversation with a colleague recently that sometimes I feel like we infantize graduate students and we forget that they're like grown-ass adults. And I think that's what you have to remind yourself, like you're a grown-ass adult and you can absolutely go and leave a university setting and it will be okay. And there will be some departments who will not like that. And there'll be some departments who won't want to bring you back in once you graduate. And those are maybe spaces you don't necessarily want to be in anyway. You know, you can absolutely do part-time work or do full-time work during graduate program. A lot of times you can make more money doing it, pending all of the issues, you know, right, about federal aid, work visas, all of those things. But I think there has been a resistance to that movement. But I think what it does is it does exactly what you said. It gets you all of these networks. It gives you space to try and experiment. I think the ability, all of the different internships I feel like I did along the way of different places, I said, yes, that. Oh, definitely not that. This is okay. Rather not. And so now at the end of it, you know, you graduate and you're like, okay, now I have a much better understanding of where I want to go, rather than experimenting when you're now on the hook for paying student loans and all, you know, all of these things, right? So I think that really allowing yourself, I think it's just such a good reminder that you don't have to ask permission to try and, you know, advocate for yourself, as Christina said, I think is so important. And I know we've kind of wanted people to take that home. And I think the other thing that you do really well, Jen, is that you don't choose, right? You work at Vera and you're at the University of Toronto and you're teaching.
I work a lot of nights, but yeah, I mean, you have to balance it. So I'm converting my thesis into a book and kind of doing what I would call a small-ish research project through my postdoc that's not related to my work at Vera. And honestly, like, teaching is a course that I've taught for years. That would be my comment there, is that, like, teaching, I taught one new course prep a couple of years ago, and that was a lot of work. Teaching one that you're comfortable with, that you've already prepared, is manageable. I don't necessarily recommend like doing new course prep on top of all of these things, but it has helped me keep up to speed on research, but also, speaking of transferable skills, that, you know, obviously teaching is public speaking, organizing material, mentoring younger people, etc. And being able to talk about teaching in a way that converts to other workplace settings that aren't formally teaching, I think, is the number of times that I've taught informally research methods inside Vera, drawing on like my actual syllabus from teaching research methods at college, it happens all the time, right? And I think we have to talk about that. The other thing I will say is that we tend to think of ourselves, like, I did my PhD in my 30s, and I really had to push to not refer to myself just as a student. And I think that's even harder if you're younger in the program. But you are an expert in the field that you studied several years of your life in depth. And I think so, not just doing internships or fellowships or things as a student, but also putting your own research work out in the world outside of academic publications is really important to assert yourself as a very knowledgeable expert on a particular area. So a few suggestions on this are, first of all, have a very basic website for yourself where you talk about yourself in terms of like the issues that you know, but for, you know, the non-academic space. Have your academic CV like downloadable there, but try to have a website so that if someone Googles you, like the story that you want them to see about yourself, that's the first thing they find, rather than your like university profile page or your Google Scholar or something. The same for LinkedIn, etc. Secondly, I think writing up, there's a couple, I haven't yet completed this, and I put a couple examples Christina put in the chat, but I think finding spaces to write about your dissertation work for the general public, shows that you can write about your area of expertise in layperson language and in short form. So op-ed in the newspaper, newsletter article in the publications of relevant NGOs or academic associations, blog posts, even your own blog on your own website is important. So I think that kind of thing positions you as an expert, but also shows that you're able to talk about your work in formats other than long form journal articles, and integrating the theoretical insights and the methodological insights into that so that you don't like bifurcate those in the same way. So also, when we ask for writing samples on job applications, then you have something to submit. And honestly, a lot of NGOs and there's a lot of forums there's a ton of online, newspapers that want in-depth explainers on X issue when it's relevant to the news, and just like finding those opportunities. And again, cold pitching, 95% of them will go unresponded, but finding those places where you can publish that is, I think, really important. And that is the top search engine result that people will find on your name, not your excellent journal article, which is very commendable and also important.
I think you're right. I think that stands, it feels like such an easy thing to do. We always say, for everything we produce, we want to like almost create 3. I always think about, I'm going to create, an academic long-form journal. I'm going to try and write a piece that's going to go into some kind of association of sorts. So it's hitting more practitioner audiences or leadership in agency spaces. And then I'm going to try and write like an op-ed or a blog or something about it. For everything that every project I have, I'm going to hit at least 3 for everything I'm doing. And so I think that those are things that you can do as grad students now for work that you're doing. And I think you're right. I mean, a colleague of mine, a postdoc fellow of mine, she used to whip out Huffington Post op-eds all the time.
Right.
And, hers would just get, one could go viral, and a couple of hers did, and especially if they're well done, they're timely, you can kind of hitch them onto a news, something that's happening in the news. These are things that are really relevant and that people are looking for. And I think they're not heavy lifts to do, these are 1,000 words, at most. That's a lot of words for some of these things, right? I know that we're closing near the bottom of the hour, so I want to make sure that if folks have questions, I've kind of been looking at the chat. I know Christina's also been helping man the chat. I haven't seen any questions come through yet, but I just wanted to give space, more, specific and targeted space to if folks did have questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or to ask them in the chat. I mean, Jen, you must have been so thorough. That must have been it.
Everybody's not actually here.
No, they're just like little screens. One of the other things that I was thinking about related to the work that you do is that you have often taught in university settings, but one thing that I don't think gets enough play, and I'm interested to hear if you've kind of done this space, is that I actually have learned that I really love teaching practitioners. And I really love doing trainings where I'm teaching practitioners the science or the research behind something. But I see that as exactly the same as teaching, right? You're still adult-based teaching that happens in the university, that's happening in these centers. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about this idea that if you really like teaching, and that's one of the reasons that's kind of holding you back from moving into these industry spaces, how you can incorporate teaching in other ways that are maybe formal or informal ways, kind of in industry space.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the place, but I think that, first of all, formal teaching happens within Vera. Like, we have a partnership with Rutgers that is teaching basically like CRIM research methods and concepts to organizations and also system impacted people who are working with us as community-based researchers. And so that's kind of like a structured course with a formal curriculum, et cetera. But also, yes, like these trainings all the time. And I think it's a space of a lot of creativity, because sometimes, I've done multi-session trainings, or sometimes you have to really pack it into an hour. But just to pull an example of something that is very I think people talk about all the time, and there's not a lot of consensus or clarity on exactly what there's no single way of looking at it, I could say. So for example, risk assessments, super common in our field. A lot of practitioners are using them all the time. There's a series of trainings that is kind of about like the existing ones and how you can think about the predictive outcomes of different ones, or et cetera. But there's a whole other set of training where you kind of unpack, like, these are the theoretical concepts that underlie this. There are several schools of thought about the merits and risks and dangers of risk assessments, and kind of walking through those, talking about like this is, from a more legal perspective, this is from a more social work perspective, this is if you're more from like a reducing recidivism perspective, and then talking about the implications, like what would it take to actually change the way that we implement existing ones, develop different categories, change who is administering the one that we do have so that the subjective intake component shifts. And like, that's very interesting. And it does involve a lot of the theoretical concepts that I think we learned pretty in depth in grad school that your average practitioner, in my experience, has never really given any thought to. And once you actually open people's minds and say, no, it's not a straight line from these dynamic and static factors to a certain outcome, and let's unpack why, they all know that intuitively from their practice, but haven't been given the space to talk about it, and some really creative ideas for how to do things differently. Well, of course, there's a zillion obstacles, but it can be a very productive space. And I think, yeah, so I actually think that's more interesting than teaching in some ways, because you can kind of connect it back to the other work.
Well, what's interesting, I think, about that, there was a time where I was taking my show on the road, kind of talking about risk assessment scores and of tools and kind of unpacking them. And what's so fascinating about that is that some of my best thinking about how to move tools forward came from those conversations, because there were practitioners asking really tough questions, right, that I don't get asked when I'm talking to my colleagues who understand what a tool is.
Right.
And I'm really being pushed to the edge to think, well, why do we do it that way?
Right.
And that is a danger. And oh, wow, that's a good point. And I think that, from those kind of teaching conversations of, here's how these tools work, really, and training conversations, really being able to only push my own research forward too. I saw in the chat that there's kind of a question from Sierra. So Sierra asked, and this goes kind of a little bit back to about navigating for yourself. How do you navigate advocating for yourself to do more of this AltAc or out of your department work? She's done some of it. She's kind of been told kind of the standard academic language of kind of just, the chain of command in so many words, and kind of told that she needs to report everything she's doing. So kind of how do you continue to advocate for yourself to move into these spaces and get exposure to these spaces?
Yeah, I think it really depends on your program and the kind of culture of your supervisor. So, I guess my short answer is make your best judgment as to how much detail you need to go into. But and again, every program is different, but for example, sometimes you have to do certain things if you're getting a certain funding package. And sometimes there's the option, like I got a couple big grants for my dissertation work, not related to paid consulting work. And so I basically was able to forego certain portions of the standard funding package. And I think that I could, you can also do that if you have other sources of income, and you can just say, I'm foregoing this component that requires me to do this RA work because I have another source of income. And you can make your judgment as to how much detail you want to go into as to what that entails, but that's valid. And as long as it's within the rules, just do it. And you probably will get some raised eyebrows. But I think the other option is to try to convert the required work. Like if it's RA or TA work, maybe just ask if you can do it on a different topic or with a different, maybe you can convert the content. That really depends more on the faculty member. But I think my biggest point would be that figure out what you absolutely have to do for your funding. And if you find something that pays better than that portion of your PhD funding, then forego that part of your PhD funding and do the better paid thing, and just tell them that that's what you're doing, and make sure you check all the requirements and the boxes. But beyond, yes, that will ruffle feathers, but that's fine.
I mean, Jay, I think you're speaking my language. I think I did exactly that in my program. Like, okay, I'm just going to do what I need to do. And I think that kind of brings us back to, Christine and I's, like, you're an adult. I know it's challenging. It's very hard. We operate in permission structures, and we have a rock star next week that's going to really talk about permission structures in the academy and how we can free ourselves from them, and really give ourselves permission to say, at the end of the day, there's a set of things I have to accomplish in this program to graduate. What is it? And then And then whatever you need to do on the side is what you need to do on the side. And it's such a challenging conversation. I think this is the one that always brings student back, like, but my department won't allow it, or I don't know, what if I get punished? And I think the reality is you will likely, perhaps depending on a department, depending on faculty, be excluded from some opportunities. You will stop getting advocated for by faculty. There are some consequences to this, but at the end of the day, you have to really kind of like take the reins on where you want to go, because ultimately that department or that set of faculty are not going to see you to where you want to go if they're not allowing you to do it now. So to think,
and I will say that,
yeah,
I think especially if you're going to apply for jobs outside academy, you can think differently about who you need for references, which is often the thing that people have in mind for, like, I have to not burn bridges. You do need at least one good reference from a faculty member out of your PhD program to vouch for your research skills. So don't burn all your bridges, like find that faculty member like Danielle and others who are on this call who will support that. It doesn't have to be your primary dissertation advisor. It could be someone else, but you don't need 5 academic references for jobs outside of academia. And in fact, in my opinion, Christina can comment, it's a disadvantage to have only professors as your reference when applying for jobs in the AltAc space. And so if you've worked with a nonprofit, with another government agency, even if you were kind of in a consulting role or you were a co-author on something, even if you weren't formally an employee, that kind of reference is super helpful, because I want, as a hiring person, to know that you can work outside of the professorial structure as well. And so what I'm trying to say is, like, keep some good academic bridges, but you don't have to keep all of them. And you do, in fact, need to cultivate some outside. So this is a set of trade-offs. And same thing when they say, like, your op-ed and your NGO newsletter and your consulting contract report that only went into a State Department black hole don't count for tenure. That's true, but they count for something else. So just, like, make your choices, knowing that different things have value to different paths, and you can keep all of those paths open, reasonably open, for a fairly long period of time. Eventually you do have to make some choices, but you don't have to decide, like, in your second year of the program which path you want to take.
I will add, I know we're coming right at time, but I think it's super important when thinking about your references. Again, what I'm looking for, whenever we have, professors who are serving as a reference, that's great. They've spent a lot of time investing in you and getting you ready for this. I'm actually looking for constructive feedback around how did someone navigate through tough times and see themselves on the other side of it. How are they going to do that? And how can I use that to inform our institute that that's how they would do it here? It's okay that you ruffle feathers. I want someone who's going to do that because it means, again, they're going to stick their neck out to accomplish the work, and that speaks leaps and bounds. So maybe burn those bridges and use them as a reference and be like, this is why the bridge burnt.
I know. Oh my gosh, we want to light everything on fire, but don't just yet. Well, listen, I know we're at the bottom of the hour, which means that we've come to time. I appreciate everyone. I appreciate everyone who joined us. I super appreciate Christina for joining us and pulling back that very velvety red curtain at Vera and pulling it back for us, so we know how we can all kind of slide into your DMs and figure out how we do work at Vera. And a super thank you for Jen for joining us, talking us through kind of your work, your experience, giving us permission to do whatever we need to do to thrive. And so I super appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks. It was really interesting.
Thank you all so much. And if anyone wants to learn more about what happens behind the curtain, I'm more than happy to have some conversations with you. So Shannon, if you want to share my email, more than happy to do that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Christina. Will do. And for everyone here, just so you know, this again will be recorded posted on the DCS website. It usually goes up in about 2 weeks or so from today. And then everyone who has received an email for the webinar will get the email that the recording has been posted. Thank you all so much. Have a good rest of your days.
Thank you.
Bye.